Oddity Archive. The time is now 9 o'clock. Our next program will begin in 15 minutes. And welcome to the Oddity Archive, the show that'll kick your stuffed clown doll's ass at tic-tac-toe, or noughts and crosses if you're English, any day of the week. I hope to answer a couple of deep, burning questions today, deep and burning if you're a total geek anyway, as they pertain to test cards and patterns. For example, what's with the girl on the BBC card? Why is she there? And more importantly, a question that's been burning on my mind for years, amongst others, what's the significance of the Indian head on the test pattern that we've been using here in the States since the dawn of commercial TV? Fair warning, this is going to be one of our little history lesson episodes. And worse yet, this is kind of one of our little down the rabbit hole topics, if you get my drift. We've all seen, at the very least, the color bars at some point in our lives, and their significance seems pretty obvious. It's a way to test the accuracy of the color on your TV, computer monitor, etc. Well, unless you were a total coward like I was growing up, in which case you figured it was just the mean old TV station trying to scare you. Like the emergency broadcast, now alert system, to the non-geek, or cowardly child as the case may be, it all seems, frankly, pretty random. At first, anyway. However, unlike the EAS, test patterns are a lot more, shall we say, functional.
The National Weather Service in Denver has issued a devastating flood warning for the following counties: Adams, Arapahoe, Arriva, Alt, Baca, and Boulder. Wait, your color is completely off. How can you expect us to warn you of this biblical level flood when your contrast is so low? Don't you care at all about picture quality? I swear, some people should never be allowed to own televisions. What a maroon.
In 1930, the BBC transmitted the first television play ever.
During the era of the Baird TV system in England, broadcast standards were few and far between. Pretty much the only broadcast standard at the time was the 3:7 aspect ratio. Indeed, the broadcasts themselves were generally somewhat inconsistent as to where exactly they fell on the broadcast spectrum, meaning that viewers were left to do a lot more fine-tuning. Though the BBC got involved in the Baird system in 1932, little was done at first to change much of anything. Some high-end televisor sets, read the Baird 30-line TV, had a crude, built-in synchronization adjustment dial to help align the picture, to help offset the inconsistencies in broadcasts as well. But what little help the average viewer would have gotten from the BBC during this period would have been via the quarter and the wedge test patterns, and those were, at best, used to give a clean image for you to attempt to adjust your reception to. Expanding on and somewhat merging the concept of title cards, the BBC introduced a mirror wheel carousel to be used with a second camera for the general purpose of transitional tasks such as station identification, generic title cards, and sign-offs. When the BBC started broadcasting via the then high-definition 405-line Marconi standard in 1936, things like exact broadcast frequency placement had finally been ironed out. in an attempt to A. let viewers know they existed, and B. help manufacturers, repairmen, and viewers test the accuracy of their TVs. The BBC began broadcasting tuning signal cards with distinct shapes and grayscale coloring between shows and at off hours. Meanwhile, here in the States, there had been some degree of experimental TV broadcasting going on since the late 20s, but unsurprisingly, any images, not just test cards, from the experimental TV era are virtually non-existent. In 1939, as RCA was developing equipment for the new medium, they created what is known as the monoscope. The monoscope is a small cathode ray tube, like that of a standard TV tube, with a single image either etched onto, or more commonly, an actual card inserted into the, if you will, bulb area. These tubes would be plugged into a dedicated monoscope camera and broadcast, usually in conjunction with a plain 350 to 1000 Hz tone. The idea behind the invention was that broadcasters would no longer have to worry about the framing of a live camera shot of a handmade card, as well as the wear and tear on said camera. Broadcasters would also have less to worry about in terms of focus and brightness levels, as those were preset in advance by whatever assigned station employee. The logic of the monoscope image was similar to that of the BBC tuning signal card. It gave something for the broadcasters to show during off hours, it gave a clean, detailed image for broadcasters and viewers to adjust their screens to, as well as some basic sound to make sure that signal was being generated on the broadcaster's end and for viewers to hear as well. Of course, viewers could have just tuned to a non-existent station to check their sound. The most common and best remembered monoscope image is that of the Indian head test pattern developed by RCA in 1939 for use in their TK1A, B, etc. series of monoscope cameras. The significance of the Indian head being that the image contained strong detail, a wide range of grayscale color, and gave a distinctive, easily identifiable image for people to clarify, if need be. As TV became more prominent, the monoscope was rejected in favor of 35mm slides and the like. With this development, as far as the test patterns were concerned, many stations used what was more or less known as the circular target image, which again allowed people to gauge the color, brightness, and calibration of their TVs. As stations went over to color broadcasting, some revised their patterns accordingly, while others continued using the old black and white patterns. Either way, some stations aired these stills while at off times at least into the late 80s, and by that point much more stable technology in TVs was being used, rendering the target pattern something of an exercise in nostalgia for those that kept using them. Back in England, between the 1940s and 60s, the BBC used a long succession of test cards, each delivering a more heavily detailed image than the last. Indeed, many other countries aped the BBC's 1960s designs, lasting to this day. But I digress. In 1967, the BBC delivered what would become its defining test card image. George Hersey was a broadcast engineer for the BBC who was charged with the task of creating a test card to test all colors, artificial and natural, for the BBC's transition to primarily color broadcasting. The idea to cast his own daughter, Carol, in the pic was born out of two very practical facts. First, the low cost, and second, the fact that children's hair and clothing styles change a lot less often than their adult counterparts, meaning that the image could be used for a much longer time with less danger of it looking dated. Just about everything within the picture of Carol holds significance. The clothing for reds, the toy clown for greens, and the blue background, read the three most basic colors. Oh yeah, and of course, Carol herself for flesh tones. The slide itself was a 35mm dual-layer slide, one layer for monochrome and one for color, in a glass frame. The X on the blackboard is the, assuming your TV is properly calibrated, dead center of the image. Test Card F and its subsequent variations, featuring Carol that is, remained in some degree of semi-regular use until the BBC's completely HD channel was closed in March of 2013, and one would imagine it might still be used in case of technical difficulties or something.
Do you remember it at all? Do you remember doing it?
I remember sitting for the photograph.
Carol herself holds the record for most broadcast screen time anywhere in the world, equivalent to about 8 years worth of screen time as of 2006. Carol herself has since become one of England's most highly regarded theatrical costume designers. Back here in the States, we began using our most ubiquitous broadcast image on a truly regular basis around 1978. However, the history goes all the way back to 1950 when a young RCA employee named David Holmes developed a generator that, well, made the color bars, as a means of giving something for everyone to refer to while developing the, still experimental, concept of color TV. These bars were officially adapted to the NTSC standard when it went into effect in 1954. This setup eventually came to be known as EIA 189A. More famously, viewers have seen the SMPTE or SMPTE color bars, SMPTE standing for the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. While I haven't found any definitive confirmation, I have good reason to believe that the SMPTE ECR1 system, if you will, was finalized by one Al Goldberg of CBS Labs in the mid-70s. The first official name of the SMPTE bars was ECR1 1978, presumably for the year it was finalized, and as I implied, there have been a couple of nominal updates since then, most notably in the transition to high definition. The easiest way to differentiate between EIA and SMPTE bars is to see whether or not it contains an extra, rather narrow row of bars. Aside from this, a fair number of variations of the color bars in general are split by an area of gray to black-ish scale on the otherwise black area in the bottom right area of the screen. This is known as plugge, and it exists to help test brightness. I can't say for sure when the color bars in general went into broadcast use, but I'm gonna say that it was sometime in the latter half of the 1960s. Unsurprisingly, the two pre-1978 off-air recordings I found with the color bars both use the EIA 189A setup. And occasionally stations would air variations on the SMPTE bars, most commonly the FCC composite card, and the multiburst. Well, that's it for today's archive. Join us next time when I unleash a serious pop quiz on your asses on the differences between EIA and SMPTE. Well, I guess it's not much of a pop quiz now, is it? Damn. See you next time.
Say, kids, what time is it? Ho, 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 ho!